HOA Karen demanded man cut down his tree, didn't know it was planted in memory of his daughter. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It started with a simple complaint. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood's rules, was out for her daily walk when she noticed a tree in Greg's front yard. The tree wasn't particularly special in appearance, a modest oak, standing tall with its branches spread wide, casting a nice patch of shade over the front of Greg's house. But to Karen, it represented an imperfection. The tree, as it did every year, was shedding its leaves, creating a mess in Greg's yard and onto the shared street. She had long been annoyed by the number of leaves that fell from the tree, making the sidewalks untidy and causing minor issues with her lawn care, which was a point of pride for Karen. Of course, this was just one of many complaints that Karen had lodged over the months, but it was the one that she felt could finally lead to some action. She wasted no time drafting an email to the HOA board, pointing out the mess the tree caused in Greg's yard and claiming it was an eyesore. The tree is not only obstructing the sidewalk with its roots, but it's also constantly dropping leaves, creating a safety hazard and lowering the curb appeal of the neighborhood, she wrote. I strongly urge the HOA to intervene and make Greg remove the tree. It was the kind of complaint that Karen had made time and time again, small issues that she felt were detracting from the perfect look of the neighborhood. She believed that a tidy, uniform community was the only acceptable one, and she had no patience for things like trees, which she considered uncontrolled nature. In her mind, the community was meant to resemble a perfect model of suburban life, where every house looked the same, and everything had its place. Greg, a quiet, reserved man, had lived in the neighborhood for years, long before Karen had moved in with her obsessive need for order. He had never once considered that his tree might be an issue. After all, it wasn't an invasive species, and its roots didn't extend beyond his yard. The tree had been a part of his home for as long as he could remember, and it held a much deeper significance than Karen would ever know. It had been planted many years ago in memory of his daughter, Sarah, who had passed away at a young age in a tragic accident. It was her favorite tree, a gift from a local nursery that Greg had carefully planted in his yard on what would have been her 12th birthday. The tree had grown alongside Greg's grief, its branches stretching up to the sky as a reminder of the joy Sarah had brought to his life. He tended to the tree as he did his memories of her, gently, lovingly, quietly. When Greg received Karen's email forwarded by the HOA board, he was initially stunned. The tree, the one constant connection to his daughter, was now being attacked because of a few falling leaves? He read through the email again, then stared out the window at the tree, its branches swaying in the breeze. To him, it wasn't just a tree, it was a piece of his daughter that had lived on, a small bit of life that kept her memory alive. He couldn't imagine living without it. The thought of cutting it down, simply to appease Karen and her obsession with the appearance of the neighborhood, felt like a betrayal to everything he had ever loved. He knew the HOA had rules about trees and landscaping, but he also knew that they couldn't possibly understand the history behind the tree. It wasn't just about leaves or roots, it was about love, loss, and remembrance. Greg didn't know what he could say to the HOA to make them understand that. It wasn't just about compliance, it was about something deeply personal. After a sleepless night, Greg decided that he would attend the next HOA meeting. He wasn't sure if it would make any difference, but he was determined to stand up for his daughter's tree. He wrote a letter explaining the tree's significance, describing how it was planted in memory of Sarah and how it had become an integral part of his life. He included photos of the tree from when it was first planted, along with pictures of Sarah, her infectious smile lighting up the photos. Greg hoped that by sharing his story, the board and the neighbors might understand why he couldn't and wouldn't remove the tree. When the HOA meeting day finally arrived, Greg walked into the community hall with his head held high, despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. The room was filled with neighbors who, for the most part, didn't know him well, just another quiet resident who kept to himself. Karen was sitting near the front, her arms crossed as she waited for the meeting to begin. She gave Greg a look that made it clear she was prepared for a fight. The board president, a man named Mr. Larson, called the meeting to order. The agenda included the usual complaints and minor issues around the neighborhood, but Greg's case was the first one to be addressed. Karen, of course, was quick to speak. "I've brought up an issue with Greg's tree," she began, her voice sharp and authoritative. "The leaves it drops cause an eyesore, and the roots are pushing into the sidewalk. I've had several complaints about it, and I think it's time the HOA take action. I'm asking for the tree to be removed to ensure the safety and cleanliness of our neighborhood." Greg could feel his face flush, his hands trembling as he prepared to speak. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he had to make them understand. "I know you all may not see this as a big deal," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But this tree is not just any tree to me. It was planted in memory of my daughter, Sarah, who died years ago. I don't think Karen or any of you understand what it means to me to have this tree here. It's not just about a few leaves or some roots. It's about remembering my daughter and keeping a piece of her alive in my life. It's the one thing I have left to hold on to her." The room fell silent. The other HOA members exchanged glances, some clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of Greg's plea. Karen's face tightened, and for the first time, her certainty seemed to waver, though she quickly regained her composure. "I understand that it's difficult," Karen said, her voice now tinged with a touch of unease, "but the rules are the rules. And I'm just looking out for the overall appearance of the neighborhood." Greg's heart sank. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to budge. He wasn't sure what else to say. But then, something unexpected happened. A woman from the back of the room, Mrs. Henderson, a neighbor Greg had never spoken to much, stood up. "I just want to say something," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've lived here for 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of complaints about leaves and trees. But I also know this neighborhood used to be a place where we respected each other's personal space and memories. Greg's tree isn't just an eyesore, it's a part of his life, and I think that's something we need to respect. I've been here long enough to know that some things are worth preserving, even if they don't fit into the perfect mold that some of us insist on. I say we leave the tree alone." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Greg felt a rush of gratitude toward Mrs. Henderson. She had spoken up, and for the first time, the tide of the conversation seemed to be shifting. "I agree," another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, added. "It's not our place to tell Greg what to do with his tree. It's a tree. It's part of what makes this neighborhood feel like home. We should be more concerned about the spirit of the place than about whether a few leaves fall on the ground." Greg couldn't believe what he was hearing. The support of his neighbors, who had been silent until now, was overwhelming. Even some of the board members seemed uncomfortable with Karen's stance, and the room seemed to be leaning toward Greg's side. After a few more moments of discussion, Mr. Larson finally spoke. "It's clear that this tree has deep personal significance for Greg, and we need to take that into account. While the HOA does have rules about property upkeep, we also value the history and community of our residents. I think it's safe to say that we won't be asking Greg to remove the tree. We'll leave it as is." Karen's face was red with frustration, but there was nothing more she could do. The board had made their decision. Greg had won, not just for himself, but for his daughter's memory, and for the neighborhood's sense of community. As the meeting adjourned and the residents began to file out, Linda, one of Greg's neighbors, gave him a supportive nod. "I'm glad you stood up for yourself, Greg. It's about more than just a tree. It's about the heart of this place." Greg smiled, feeling the weight of the past few days lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged, like the community had come together to do what was right. And for him, that meant everything. The tree remained, as it always had been, a symbol of love, loss, and remembrance. And now, it was also a symbol of the strength of a community that chose to support each other, no matter the obstacles in their way. After the HOA meeting where Greg had defended the tree that meant so much to him, there was an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with disbelief. He had expected to face a much harder battle, one that might require more than just his own resolve and the story of his daughter's memory. But the support he had received from his neighbors, the surprising shift in the room when they spoke up in his favor, made him feel like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. It was as if the very air in the neighborhood had changed, and for the first time, Greg felt the possibility of truly living in a place where he could simply exist without constant judgment. When he returned home that evening, he found himself staring at the tree in his front yard, its branches gently swaying in the late afternoon breeze. The thought of it being threatened had almost seemed surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but now, with the decision in his favor, he felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. The tree, with its thick trunk and sprawling branches, was not just a living memorial to his daughter, it was also a symbol of his fight for personal freedom, for the right to grieve, to remember, and to maintain something that had meaning in a world that sometimes felt cold and indifferent. Greg's relationship with the tree had always been quiet, intimate, and personal. He had cared for it not just as a way of honoring Sarah but as a living piece of his own heart that had continued to grow, even in the face of loss. Now, it seemed as though the entire neighborhood had recognized that. But while the victory felt sweet, it was not without its complications. Greg knew that Karen, who had spent the better part of the last few weeks obsessing over this tree and her complaints about it, would not simply walk away with her tail between her legs. He had seen the sharp look in her eyes during the meeting. Her pride had been wounded. It was a part of her character that Greg had come to understand through the months of seeing her scrutinize every detail of the neighborhood. Karen wasn't just someone who followed rules, she was someone who believed she had the power to dictate the lives of those around her. She had built herself up as a figure of authority in the neighborhood, and Greg knew her pride wouldn't allow her to let go of something she felt had slipped from her grasp. Sure enough, the next few days brought little peace. Karen kept to her usual routine of walking the neighborhood, but now, there was something different in the way she walked. She moved with a purpose, her eyes often darting from house to house as if looking for new violations, new ways to insert herself into the lives of others. Greg had never been one to take notice of Karen's comings and goings, but now, every time she passed by his house, he felt her eyes on him, watching him, waiting for the next opportunity to bring up the tree again or find something else to critique. The subtle tension that had been building in the neighborhood before the meeting had never really disappeared. Now, it just seemed to be bubbling under the surface, like a simmering pot that was close to boiling over. It wasn't until the following weekend that Greg noticed something strange. He was out working in his garden, trimming the edges of the bushes and pulling weeds from around the base of the tree, when he noticed a group of neighbors gathered near the park at the end of the street. They weren't talking, at least not in a way that seemed friendly or welcoming. Their conversations were low, murmured, and when Greg looked up, he saw a few of them glance in his direction, clearly aware of his presence but not acknowledging him. It wasn't a warm reception. In fact, it felt like a gathering of people who had more to say but were too afraid to say it out loud. Greg could feel the weight of their stares, their disapproving glances, and the lingering silence that followed every time he caught one of them watching him from across the street. It was as if they were waiting for someone to take the next step, for someone to make a move that would break the stalemate. But it was clear that the support he had received at the meeting had not been enough to erase the undercurrent of discomfort, the lingering resentment from some of his neighbors, many of whom had silently sided with Karen during her crusade against the tree. Greg had always been the quiet type. He didn't make waves, didn't stir up trouble, and he had always believed that living in a community meant keeping to yourself and respecting others. But now, as the unease lingered, he began to question whether that was enough. Had he been wrong to think that the tree, his daughter's tree, could be something he could simply protect without resistance? Had he assumed that others would understand the significance of what it meant to him and leave him to his own peace? His heart began to race, and for the first time in a long time, he found himself wondering whether the neighborhood, with its unspoken rules and quiet judgments, was really the place he had imagined it to be. Over the next few days, the tension seemed to grow. Small comments from neighbors, comments that had once seemed like friendly banter, started to feel more like passive-aggressive remarks. He'd overhear things like, "Maybe it's time for Greg to prune that tree again," or "I thought the HOA had already addressed the issue with the leaves." No one would say anything outright, but it was clear that the community, or at least a portion of it, had become divided. Some neighbors had sided with him, supporting his right to keep the tree, while others, probably the ones who had always agreed with Karen's worldview, had quietly sided against him. The division wasn't as clear-cut as the HOA vote had been. It wasn't about rules or bylaws, it was about something deeper. It was about the way people looked at him now, as if he were the one who had disrupted the peace, the one who had upset the natural order by standing up for his daughter's memory. Greg tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his work, his yard, and the small joys of his daily life, but the sense of alienation gnawed at him. He couldn't help but feel that, despite his best efforts, the community had become an arena for conflict rather than camaraderie. He no longer felt like part of the neighborhood in the same way. There was a heaviness that lingered in the air whenever he walked out of his house, a feeling that he was being watched, judged, and silently criticized. Even the children, who had once greeted him with friendly waves, now seemed to glance away when they saw him. It wasn't overt, but it was there, the subtle distancing, the quiet shifting that came when someone was seen as an outsider, even if that wasn't the intention. Greg had always been a man who believed in maintaining peace and keeping his personal life separate from the drama of others. He had never sought to make waves, but now he realized that peace could sometimes be an illusion. What had felt like a victory at the HOA meeting had merely been a temporary respite from something that went much deeper, a question of belonging, of fitting in, of how a community chooses who is welcome and who is not. The turning point came one evening when Greg received a letter from the HOA. It was a formal letter, addressed to him personally, and it seemed to be the final word on the matter of the tree. He sat down at his kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it. The letter was polite but firm. It stated that while the HOA would not require him to remove the tree, they encouraged him to take further action to mitigate any inconvenience to his neighbors. The suggestion was clear: trim the tree, cut back the branches, and make sure the leaves didn't fall onto the street or the park. The HOA, it seemed, wasn't interested in taking sides, but they were still trying to appease Karen and her supporters by imposing some form of control over Greg's property. Greg set the letter down and stared at it, the weight of the words pressing down on him. He had fought for the tree. He had won, in a way, but now he was being asked to compromise. To make changes. To bend to the will of a community that didn't understand why the tree mattered so much to him. He had thought that standing up for the tree, for Sarah's memory, had been enough, but it seemed the struggle was far from over. As he sat there, a deep sigh escaping his lips, Greg realized something. He had been fighting for the wrong thing. He hadn't been fighting just for a tree, or even just for his daughter's memory. He had been fighting for the right to live in a place where he wasn't judged for holding on to something personal, something meaningful. It wasn't just the tree that needed protection, it was his right to exist, to remember, and to be part of something that allowed him to be himself without fear of being erased by the rules of those who thought they knew better. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The following days felt like a tug-of-war for Greg. The letter from the HOA had left a bitter taste in his mouth, one that he couldn't quite shake off. The compromise they were offering wasn't truly a victory, it was a concession, a way to placate him while still forcing him to bend to the will of Karen and those who thought his tree was nothing more than a nuisance. He had hoped that the HOA's initial decision to let the tree remain would be enough. He had imagined that, with the truth about its significance known, everyone would understand the necessity of allowing it to stay, to grow, to continue serving as a living memory of his daughter. But it seemed that understanding was too much to expect from a community that prioritized conformity over personal meaning. He found himself spending hours staring out the window at the tree, watching as the breeze gently stirred its branches. The sight of it, with its leaves turning golden at the edges, felt like a slow exhale, a small, beautiful part of his past that was slowly being suffocated by the weight of the neighborhood's expectations. He had always taken comfort in the tree, in knowing that Sarah's memory was rooted deep into the earth, something tangible he could see, touch, and nurture. But now, that connection was being threatened by rules that didn't care about the emotional significance of a tree or the history behind it. What were a few fallen leaves, a handful of roots that extended just beyond the curb, when compared to the weight of a father's love for his child? The question gnawed at him, but Greg knew that the answer wasn't simple. He couldn't just ignore the HOA's demands. Not now. Not when they were sending letters and drawing lines in the sand. Not when Karen was so intent on having her way, using the community as her weapon. He had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be in this moment. Did he want to be the quiet neighbor who bowed to the pressure, who trimmed back the tree, cut off its limbs for the sake of peace? Or did he want to stand firm, to continue fighting for something that, deep down, he knew was worth defending, even if it meant standing alone? The frustration kept building up inside him as he spent another night drafting a response to the HOA. The letter was polite but firm, and it explained, in no uncertain terms, how important the tree was to him and why he couldn't comply with their suggestion. It wasn't about the tree's appearance or its branches; those were mere technicalities in the grand scheme of things. This was about his daughter, about preserving her memory in a way that was personal to him. He couldn't just cut it down, couldn't strip it of its significance for the sake of someone else's idea of what was acceptable. He didn't care if the leaves fell into the street. He didn't care if the roots pushed against the curb. What mattered was the tree itself, the symbol of a love that would never die. Greg sent the letter, but as the days went by, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. Karen had a way of making things personal, of turning every small issue into a vendetta. He had seen it before in the way she would report minor infractions to the HOA, the way she would insist that every tree be pruned, every flower bed be arranged just so. She was relentless in her pursuit of perfection, and Greg knew that she wouldn't rest until she had her way. It was the way she had carried herself through the neighborhood, always looking for something to fix, something to complain about. He had always been a passive observer, trying to keep his head down and avoid confrontation, but now he was at the center of it. As the weekend rolled around, Greg found himself walking past Karen's house again. He had been avoiding her for days, not sure what to say or how to deal with the tension that hung in the air whenever their paths crossed. But today, it was different. Karen was standing outside, talking to a group of neighbors. Greg wasn't sure if they were discussing the tree or something else, but as soon as she saw him approaching, Karen stopped mid-sentence and turned to face him. The others followed suit, their eyes shifting from Greg to Karen, waiting for the confrontation to unfold. "Greg," Karen said, her tone dripping with a thin layer of politeness that didn't quite mask the edge in her voice. "I've read your letter. It's clear you're not going to comply with the HOA's request. But I'll say it again, that tree is a nuisance. It's causing problems for the neighborhood, and it's only going to get worse. You're being selfish by refusing to take responsibility for it." Greg's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his composure. He had already made his stand, and there was no reason to back down now. "Karen," he said evenly, "this isn't about you or me. It's about the tree. And you don't understand why it's so important to me. It's not just some decoration or an aesthetic choice. It's a piece of my daughter's memory. It means more to me than anything else in this neighborhood." Karen rolled her eyes, and Greg could see her posture stiffen with annoyance. "I don't care about your sentimental attachment to the tree. What I care about is the fact that it's affecting the neighborhood. You're making this about something personal, but we're all part of this community, and we all have to follow the rules. If you don't do something about that tree, I'll make sure the HOA takes more drastic action. We can't let this slide just because it's a memorial." The words cut through Greg like a blade, and for a moment, he stood there, unsure of what to say. He had never felt so alone in his life. This was no longer just about a tree, it was about his right to grieve, to hold on to something that connected him to his daughter. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the silent judgment that permeated the air. The neighborhood was watching. They were waiting for him to back down, to bend to the pressure, to comply with the rules that had been laid out before him. But then, something inside him shifted. He remembered Sarah's smile, the way she had loved that tree, the way she had laughed and run under its branches as a child. This tree wasn't just some decoration. It was his way of keeping her close, of remembering her every day. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. "I'm not cutting down the tree," Greg said, his voice steady and strong. "Not for you. Not for the HOA. And certainly not for anyone who thinks they have the right to tell me how to remember my daughter." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Karen looked stunned, and the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond. Greg stood his ground, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. This wasn't just about a tree anymore. It was about his right to honor his daughter in a way that made sense to him. And if that meant going against the tide, then so be it. For a long moment, Karen said nothing. Then, with a huff, she turned on her heel and stormed off, her footsteps loud against the pavement. The other neighbors lingered for a moment, exchanging looks but not saying a word. Greg could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He had made his choice, and now, it was up to them to decide what kind of community they wanted to be. As for him, he was done hiding. He was done letting the rules and the expectations of others define who he was or what he valued. The days that followed were quieter. The tension between Greg and Karen didn't dissipate, but the neighbors seemed to understand that he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to cut down the tree, and that was his decision to make. As the leaves continued to fall, he spent more time in his yard, caring for the tree, trimming its branches, and honoring Sarah's memory. The tree was more than just a tree, it was his act of defiance against a world that often wanted to strip away the things that mattered most. And in that quiet, simple act of care, Greg found peace. He knew the fight wasn't over, that there would always be people like Karen who would try to impose their vision of the world on others, but he also knew that he didn't have to let them win. The tree stood tall in the yard, its branches spreading wide into the sky, a testament to the strength of his love for his daughter and his refusal to let that love be diminished by anyone else's rules. It was, in every way, his own small victory. Weeks passed since Greg had made his stand, and though the tension between him and Karen was still palpable, something had shifted in the neighborhood. It was subtle, but there was a change. No longer was there the constant murmuring about his tree or the complaints that had once plagued his quiet existence. The neighborhood had moved on from the tree controversy, at least outwardly, but it was clear that Karen, still stewing in her sense of entitlement and frustration, wasn't done. Her temper, though she tried to hide it, was fraying at the edges, and Greg could feel it. It wasn't just about the tree anymore. It was about control, about winning a battle that she felt had slipped through her fingers, and she wasn't about to let Greg's quiet rebellion go unpunished. Greg had expected retaliation, of course. He had braced himself for it since the moment he had stood up for his daughter's memory and the tree that symbolized it. He had prepared himself to be the neighborhood pariah, but what had caught him off guard was how much people had begun to avoid him. It wasn't as if they openly sided with Karen, but there was an undeniable shift in the way he was perceived. He had gone from being a quiet neighbor, a man whose life had been defined by tragedy and who had found solace in the small things, to someone who had disrupted the peace in a way that others found uncomfortable. People didn't know how to deal with him anymore. The neighbors who had once waved and exchanged pleasantries now avoided his gaze or found ways to keep their distance, as if they feared the consequences of being associated with him. Even the children, who had played under the shade of the tree in years past, had begun to shy away. Their laughter, once a constant in the air, had faded into the background as the neighborhood silently took sides. One evening, as Greg sat on his porch, staring at the tree and reflecting on everything that had transpired, he felt a growing sense of isolation. He had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had preserved his daughter's memory in a way that he felt was right, but at what cost? Was it worth the alienation, the whispers behind his back, and the coldness that now defined his interactions with the people he had once called neighbors? The peaceful life he had imagined when he first moved into the neighborhood had crumbled, replaced by a constant undercurrent of tension. It wasn't just Karen anymore, it was the community itself that felt fractured, divided between those who supported him and those who thought his actions had disrupted their way of life. The fallout had been more significant than he had realized, and the realization weighed heavily on him as the days stretched on. As he sat there, lost in thought, the sound of footsteps on the gravel caught his attention. He looked up to see a figure approaching, Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had stood up for him at the HOA meeting. She had been one of the few who had shown support, and her actions had been a welcome relief in the midst of everything that had transpired. She was a woman in her late 50s, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, and her eyes were warm, kind, but tired, as if she had lived through many struggles of her own. "Mind if I join you?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice soft but firm, as she took a seat on the edge of Greg's porch. Of course, Greg replied, surprised by her visit. It's good to see you. Mrs. Henderson nodded, glancing toward the tree before turning her gaze back to Greg. I wanted to check in on you, she said. It's been a while, and I know things have been tense with Karen and the others. Greg sighed, the weight of the past few weeks settling back onto his shoulders. Yeah, it's been tough. I thought once the HOA decided to leave the tree alone, things would calm down. But it feels like the worst is still ahead. People have started treating me like I'm some sort of troublemaker. I didn't ask for any of this, and now it's like everything has changed. Mrs. Henderson looked at him, her expression softening with understanding. I know it's been hard, Greg. I can see that. But you have to know, there are still plenty of people in this neighborhood who appreciate what you've done. Who understand that this tree isn't just a tree, it's a piece of your heart. The people who don't get it, who are siding with Karen, they're the ones who don't understand what it means to truly live in a community, to respect the personal lives and histories of your neighbors. Greg nodded, grateful for her words, though he still felt the sting of isolation. I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep fighting this battle. Every day feels like a struggle. It's not just Karen, it's everyone else, too. They're all watching me now, waiting for me to mess up, to prove that I'm not one of them. Mrs. Henderson's gaze grew steely, her eyes locking onto his. Don't you dare think that. You've already proven more than enough. You've shown more courage than most of us ever could. You're not fighting against them, Greg. You're fighting for what's right. You're standing up for your daughter, for your own right to remember her however you choose. And that's worth more than all the opinions of people who don't understand. Don't let them wear you down. Don't let Karen, or anyone, make you question that. Greg felt a lump form in his throat, the overwhelming emotion he had been carrying for so long threatening to spill over. He had always believed in doing the right thing, in living quietly, and honoring his daughter's memory in his own way. But he had never realized just how lonely that path could be. He had never anticipated the way his simple act of remembrance could create such a divide in his community. Mrs. Henderson's words, though, brought him a sense of clarity that he had been searching for. She was right. He wasn't fighting for the tree. He wasn't fighting against Karen. He was fighting for the integrity of his love for Sarah, for the memory that had sustained him through the hardest years of his life. That was worth defending, even if it meant standing alone. He had already won in one sense. The tree was still there, standing tall, just as Sarah had been in his heart. But perhaps it wasn't just about the victory itself. Perhaps it was about the strength it took to hold on to something so deeply personal, to make a stand not for the approval of others, but for the truth of who he was. That evening, as Mrs. Henderson left, she gave him a parting smile. Don't forget, Greg, she said, we're all here. You're not alone. And no matter what happens, your daughter's memory will always be a part of this neighborhood, even if some people can't see it yet. The word stayed with him long after she had gone, and for the first time in weeks, Greg felt something shift within him. He was no longer worried about what others thought. He wasn't concerned with being liked, with fitting in. He was standing firm in his truth, and that was enough. The next morning, when Karen walked by with her usual air of superiority, Greg stood by the tree, his hands folded calmly in front of him. She paused when she saw him, her eyes narrowing with obvious disdain. You really think you've won, don't you? She said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Greg didn't flinch. He met her gaze directly, his voice unwavering. I'm not trying to win, Karen. I'm just trying to remember my daughter the way I choose to. Karen opened her mouth, perhaps to say something biting, but then seemed to reconsider. She turned away without another word and walked off, her steps quick and determined. Greg watched her go, but this time, there was no anger in his heart. There was no fear of retaliation. He was done letting her, or anyone else, control how he remembered the most important person in his life. As he stood there, surrounded by the rustling leaves of the tree, Greg realized that this was more than just a battle for a tree or a neighborhood dispute. It was about the resilience of love, about the strength to honor what mattered most, no matter the obstacles in the way. And with that understanding, he finally felt peace, deep, lasting peace that could not be taken from him. He had fought for what mattered. He had won, not just for the tree, but for Sarah, for the memory that would forever grow in his heart, just as the tree continued to grow in his yard.